We got Jason Collins on the podcast. Jason has been blogging for years, and I've recently reintroduced reading blogs into my life, and Jason's has long been a favorite of mine. And he blogs about the intersection of behavioral economics and evolutionary biology, which is an intersection of two of my dilettante interests. And in his day job, Jason leads PricewaterhouseCoopers Australia's behavioral economics division. So he studied it, he practices it in his real life, and he blogs about it. And again, this combination of evolutionary biology and behavioral economics is super, super interesting. And Jason has long been posting about the fact that we may actually be more rational than we seem, right? On the internet, it's very common to talk about cognitive biases and flaws in our thinking, but a lot of these things may actually make more sense when viewed through an evolutionary lens. And Jason recently had a series of technical blog posts on ergodicity and how that actually impacts what may make sense for people to do in certain types of situations. So this can get a little bit technical in terms of the understanding of some of the probabilistic concepts and some of the mathematics. And we try to talk through that. And apologies in advance, because I do actually use some technical terms incorrectly in this in this interview, which really drives me nuts when I hear other people do that. But kind of speaking extemporaneously, started throwing out terms like path dependence and asymptote without really thinking about what I was saying. So apologies in advance for that. But this is super, super interesting stuff, and it hopefully gives some insight into why some of our seemingly faulty decision-making processes actually make a lot of sense when viewed through a certain lens. So enjoy this one. We have these brains in our heads that are seemingly these marvelous creations of, nature, God, whatever, to start off with a nice controversy. But some people seem to think that these brains are pretty miscalibrated, that they make a bunch of errors repeatedly, that we're bad at statistical reasoning, that we kind of make clunky inferences that aren't totally correct. But simultaneously, we seem to be capable of pretty remarkable things for a bunch of lightly haired apes that are just kind of traipsing around a big wet planet. To sort of get more specific about that, right? There's concepts in behavioral economics related to cognitive bias and systematic errors that human beings make in reasoning. And there seems to be a little bit of a controversy over, how much we have flaws, let's say, in our reasoning, and how much we're kind of just these foolish creatures who don't know what we're doing, versus how much some of the things that on the surface appear to be irrational are actually adaptive decision-making styles that were appropriate for certain scenarios that, may have benefited our ancestors. So your writing has a lot to do with kind of weighing these different viewpoints and sort of figuring out, are the decisions that we make rational or are they irrational? Are they foolish or are they smarter than we may realize? So can you kind of frame that controversy for us?
Sure. Sometimes I feel like I'm having a bit of a glass half full, half empty sort of debate in this space, because a case can be made for each side. But as you started, we are, we're fairly lightly haired apes, but we've been shaped by environment for a pretty long time, and evolution is a powerful force. And just the mere fact we're here, we're functioning, we've managed to survive and reproduce for however many billion years is a pretty good sign. And when you look at a lot of our decision making in that context, it's pretty powerful. The flip side, though, is that it's really easy to create scenarios where our decisions just don't look that great. You give people certain logic problems and systematically will err, or you can get people to make different decisions just based on simple framing. So it's quite easy to mess up this this otherwise pretty good decision-making system. And so for me, the big question about this debate isn't so much around, should we call ourselves completely rational? Should we think of ourselves as predictably irrational? But to just go more broadly, for our everyday decision making, so not logic puzzles that we're doing sitting in a lab in a psychology school, but in the way we go about our day-to-day business, are we making good decisions? And I think that's actually it's a tough question. I think we do pretty well, and there's a lot of evidence that we do. But the reason why I'm in a job, I work at day to day as a behavioral economist, is that we can still find places where a bit of a nudge, a bit of help, a slightly different frame can actually shift them so that people can make a better decision.
Yeah, totally. So you mentioned the concept of nudging, right? And
Yeah.
there's a decent amount of research on this, and this is also a concept that seems to be it really tickles a certain fancy in people, right? That especially folks who listen to podcasts, maybe like this one, Freakonomics, NPR, TED Talks, et cetera. This concept of like a little behavioral trick and like a sort of quirky psychological hack resulting in a big difference is something that seems to really appeal to people. So, we have these effects that can be shown, like you said, in a lab, but they potentially get extrapolated in a way that isn't totally appropriate for the way we actually make decisions. Is that a good way of thinking about that?
Yeah, I think so. And as for why people get interested, I think back to like the very first moment I got interested and thought, wow, this is amazing. And it was actually a Dan Ariely talk. I think it was probably at the RSA or something like that. But anyway, and through it, he ran through all these examples, funky experiments. Such as if you give people words relating to old people, they'll walk slow when they leave the room. False result, but anyway, it sounded pretty funky at the time. And that I just went, wow, this is absolutely amazing. And what follows pretty quickly if you get into that literature or listen to enough of those podcasts is people start to go, if we have all these problems, then we should be able to nudge people to help them out. The thing which I find quite interesting in this though is that when you're there going, I'm going to nudge this person or I'm going to help them make a better decision, quite often it's not that clear what actually is a better decision. Like to know what's a better decision for a person, you really need to know a lot about what they're trying to achieve. Like what is this person really trying to do? And for me, I think the big, this is actually the danger in nudging. The thing that makes me quite uncomfortable all the time is that people are introducing nudges to change behavior when in fact that behavior is probably, for the particular problem or objective of that person might be a bit more rational than we're actually assuming.
Yeah, totally. So to give an example of a nudge that might be sort of on the more like less controversial end, let's say.
Yes.
A default opt-in for being an organ donor is an example where you can dramatically increase the number of people who actually, opt in to being an organ donor in their, in our case, in our state, et cetera, by making that the default option. Like if you have a driver's license, you are automatically an organ donor, as opposed to someone having to actually, fill out another form or check another box or submit something, right? So in that case, you can sort of nudge people to be organ donors just by making it the default scenario, as opposed to other cases where it might be a little bit more unclear exactly what the mechanism is by which we're sort of changing that behavior.
Yeah, well, although let me be the devil's advocate on that organ donor example, because it's really quite interesting how far that default idea can go in some places. So in Europe, where a lot of the early research was reported, and in fact, you read a lot of books such as Dan Ariely's, and they'll tell this story about how you go to Germany and the donation rate, the organ donor rate is in those who are registered organ donors will be 66%. And yet in Austria, it'll be 99.5%. And it's that opt-in, opt-out framing. But then you find what opting people in really means. And it just means this person's born, they're assumed to be an organ donor. And if you want to get out of it, you've got to go to a certain government department, you've got to find the form, you've got to fill it out. It's a pretty complicated process. There's a lot of sludge for people who really perhaps don't want to be organ donors. But the interesting thing about it is how it plays out when these people actually die. Because, of course, once they've been opted in, and they talk to their family. In the end, they don't just sort of rip the organs out of the person. But when they talk to the family, quite often that family will say, we actually know nothing about this person's intentions. Maybe they didn't want to be an organ donor. I know you assumed they'd be one, but look, maybe they just didn't get time to get the form. And so as a result, the organ donation rates across sort of countries with those different kinds of policies are actually, not that nowhere near as different as you'd think from the rate that people are registered as organ donors. And so here you actually come to, I think there's actually a good third choice here. And it's the idea called active choice, is where you don't assume people are organ donors or not, but when they get their driver's license, you really make them opt in. So you make them choose which one it is exactly they want to be. So to get your driver's license, you have to tick one of these two boxes. We don't care which one, but just tick one of them. And that then actually shows some degree of intention. It's something you can have a conversation with the family about after their death, and you're far more likely to get a good discussion. But mate, so maybe now I've poked that one. How about I try and give one that's a little bit easier? So quite often I find in my legwork, I work with financial services firms a lot, and they'll have products and they'll have a honeymoon interest rate, say, and this interest rate will pay them some amazing amount of interest for say 3 months, something like that. And so they'll put their money in, they'll get great interest for 3 months, and then they'll just forget about it. And then it'll be sitting in this savings account that just sucks compared to all the other options out there. And so we spend a lot of time going, how can we just get someone just to put this money in an account where they get more interest? Because they're simply just leaving money on the table, whether they're procrastinating, whether they're not paying enough attention. That's an open question. But there definitely are places where you go, okay, there's probably some people doing something here that just seems to be dominated by another option.
Yeah, I got it. So in the financial services industry, that's an area in particular where, there's whatever, let's call it some sort of opportunity cost to people, not moving their money around or being aware of the types of decisions that they're making, and that they'll kind of default to inertia and
Yes.
just sort of leave their money somewhere that isn't ideal, and that there are potential ways to, force them, not even force them, but to get them to make a better decision with their money. Like what would be some ways that are, effective in that scenario?
Quite simply, in that case, a reminder, like nothing more than something to put on their radar. What that reminder looks like, whether it's a text message, how it arrives, it could be a link to allow them to actually shift it. So in the UK, they did experiments. Their Financial Conduct Authority ran experiments and found that just giving people a pre-filled form that they simply needed to submit was the best way to get them to shift accounts. So quite often, like it's actually not too sort of, for all the excitement and sexiness of a lot of behavioral economics, a lot of the most practical measures in the field are actually the most boring. Remind people, send them something that's timely, make it easy, help them out, write in plain English. And you do that, and that's sort of 80% of the gain a lot of the time. And then once you've got that in place, then you might go, okay, well, does a loss frame help us here? That because people tend to pay more attention to losses than to gains. Should we talk about the social context? Because people look for cues such as, what do other people do? So should we tell them that 90% of people shift their account after their honeymoon interest rate expires, that kind of thing. So there's a pretty big bucket of tools there. I should say, like, one reason why the financial services space is so I like it for this nudging space is that it's about money, and it's kind of like converting money for money. So a lot of our decisions outside of, say, the lab, a lot of decisions that people try and nudge, they involve trade-offs between really quite difficult concepts. Whereas at least in when you're getting someone to earn more interest in one account versus another, it's dollars for dollars. So it's a lot easier to go, okay, maybe this decision isn't great. In other places, it's a lot tougher to do.
Yeah, and you mentioned these different ways of framing certain problems or ways of trying to initiate some behavior change. And like I said before, there's sort of sexiness to the concept of like, oh, just do one little tweak and you get this large change in behavior, you get this huge effect size. And I think that, anyone who's sort of paid attention to reproducibility of research in the social sciences has sort of seen like, okay, we have a lot of stuff with like pretty implausible effect sizes, and a lot of that research ends up not being repeatable. And sort of simultaneously in the more like direct marketing space where people are constantly A/B testing, like you said, different messaging, like, hey, should we, try to make someone sort of scared of something to get them to take action? Should we sort of lean on social proof and show a celebrity, et cetera? And what you see in that space often is sort of like a regression to the mean effect, where you can do something that has a large effect size, and then, you change the call to action on your homepage to a certain phrasing, or you change the color of the button, and then within 2 months, the conversion rate goes right back to where it was, despite actually being bumped. So how do you think about like what is actually real with this, like, regression to the mean and like difficulty reproducing stuff?
Yeah. Well, that reproducibility process is like plays really large in my mind, because ultimately, if you try, so much of what's out there, so many of the reports in the scientific literature, so many of the ideas that are reported as working in business, they're just spurious results. And for me, there's a few filters that I try and apply when I'm looking at these to go, okay, well, what should I pay attention to? So the first one is sort of, I call it, the effect is too large heuristic. And I saw there's actually a statistician, Daniel Larkins, who I saw who actually writes a lot about this. And I think it's a really important idea. But some things you just see a large effect and you go, that's just sausage. Like, the reality is most social psychology kind of interventions, they're going to, small effect sizes that you really need huge populations in an experiment or in a trial to detect. And so if you see this, something that's changed the behavior of 40-50% of the population, that's likely not true. And like a great example of that one is, I don't know if you've seen it, there was this paper years ago about judges in Israel, and it was that they were doing parole hearings, and as the day goes on, they start off giving parole to, I think, 60-70% of people who are in front of them, and then as they get towards their break time, so leading up to their lunch, that parole rate drops to almost zero. And so this paper's saying, hypothesizing, is it decision fatigue? There's people just getting hungry, but either way, this looks like it. If you're the guy before lunch, you're not getting parole. But just think about it, like a plunge of 60 to 70 percentage points in the rate of parole. It just doesn't sound real. Like if the effects were that strong, we'd be just seeing them everywhere. Like we'd probably be banning decisions before lunch, and then of course what happened is later on we start to see more information about this trial coming out. For a start, it's not random which cases are heard first in a session. Those who are represented, so have a lawyer, tend to go first. I know myself, I was a lawyer back in my youth, and I know that there'd be quite a bit of bartering at the beginning of any session to try and see which ones come up, and those are the easiest were normally the first ones that were heard. So anyway, so that case just came absolutely crumbling down, but I think that like the sign should have just been there from the beginning. This effect is just too big to be true. I actually use a second filter as well, and this is a bit around my background. So my PhD combined economics and evolutionary biology. So evolutionary biology is a big thing in my mind. And so I actually just, one of my little filters is I go, why would we have evolved this particular decision-making mechanism? Like why is it we'd react in that way? So, you'd assume that if our decision-making sort of just crashed so quickly leading up to lunch, we'd probably have a different eating pattern. We probably wouldn't be such, gorging and waiting. We'd be snacking all day. But you see that across, the raft of the stuff that's coming out. So that one I mentioned at the beginning around people walking slowly after they heard words about old people. So this was work by social psychologist John Barge, and basically what they found is that it was probably just wishful experimenters a bit too quick on the stopwatch because they knew who was who, and that just fell apart. But you go, well, why on earth? Like, can you think of a single sort of reason as to why our decision-making apparatus would have evolved to be so sensitive to reading words about old people and then reacting to it? Like, why would that be the case? And it's really hard to come up with a story. It's not in the end, it's not a great. I don't think it's a great negative filter because a lot of these, to be honest, some of the evolutionary sort of papers themselves suffer from similar problems. But when you're starting to go, okay, well, which of these are not likely that, which of these are just don't seem to have that underlying explanation. I think it's a nice way of just going, okay, let's be a little bit more skeptical about this particular idea.
Yeah, you mentioned the idea of these implausible effect sizes, which I think is Andrew Gelman has a really great way of framing that, which he calls the Piranha Problem, which I think is like a pretty great visual way of thinking about it, where it's like, okay, if you throw a bunch of piranhas in a small tank together, pretty soon they're going to start eating each other, and it's going to be like this messy disaster. So if you have all these super large effects of like, oh, well, yeah, if you read a word about an old person and you didn't eat lunch and you saw the chips before you saw the, salad or whatever, like, and each of these is going to nudge your behavior 35% in one direction or the other, you would expect like really just bizarre stuff happening to people all the time, which just doesn't pass the sniff test.
Yeah, indeed. I've learned more than from Andrew Gelman about statistics than I did from every statistics course I ever did at university. I think sort of the way that he thinks about these problems and beyond the effect is too large heuristic, so many of his other ideas, such as the garden of forking paths in the way that experiments are designed, are really powerful ways to think about the literature that you see in front of you. But I think his Piranha Problem is exactly right. Like, how could you ever capture everything that's going on in your write-up of an experiment? Like, you just find that if there were so many effects such as that, like you'd have to, you'd be writing down what color room did we run this experiment in? What was the age of the people in here? Were the experimenters white, male or female? And on and on. And in the end, you'd have, an appendix hundreds of pages long just trying to capture, every minor detail. Like, it was 32 degrees outside and the Red Sox just won the World Series. Like, you'd never finish.
Yeah. And you mentioned the garden of forking paths. Can you give a brief explanation of that as well?
Sure. So when you run an experiment, it's most people don't really know exactly what's going to come out along the way. So you've got a concept in your mind, right? So you go, I've got a hypothesis. Let's suppose that old people, the people walk slower if they've heard words that are associated with old people, such as Florida. So then I run the experiment. Get a whole bunch of people. I time them, but then what happens is, in the running of the experiment, there's things that can happen there. So one of the possible reasons why that experiment went wrong is because those who were timing actually knew who was who, so they might have clicked wrong. So you actually got, here you're starting to see, when I say forking paths, different ways the experiment can go wrong. But the big one is actually around the way that people do analysis, the way that they pull apart the data that they gather. Because when you get a data set in front of you, there's so many ways that you can cut and slice it. And in the end, it's you can almost always cut and slice it in a way where you'll find some effect that passes what they call the statistical significance thresholds. This is they use this level 0.05, so there's a 5% chance that the data you see, they said, I'm going to botch this because I always do, but basically the idea behind statistical significance is you say there's only a 5% chance that we get data as extreme as that we saw if the hypothesis that we have, that we're trying to disprove was true. So they have this filter, but when you cut the experiment in different ways, there's so many ways you can pass that threshold. So you might go, oh, maybe there's a difference between how men and women react. Maybe let's just check it in the young people. Hang on, here's 4 people here that actually stopped at the candy machine walking down the corridor that we're timing. So let's exclude them. Hang on, should we be using this test or that test? And by the time they've worked through it all, played with enough times, they find something, and that just happens to be what then gets reported. The last forking path, of course, is that then, of course, when it gets sent off to a journal, those results that sound the most interesting, most sexy, and actually find something are those that end up out there. But it's just this, I suppose in a nutshell, though, this garden of forking paths is the fact that with an experiment, there's so many ways that you can go that you can almost always generate a result. And as a result, or if you can almost always generate a result, how much should you trust it?
Yeah, totally. That maybe a way of framing some of those issues is that, say you were being dealt a hand of cards, right? And anyone who's played any sort of poker or whatever has an understanding that, like, okay, it's relatively rare to get whatever, let's say 3 of a kind in a hand, but it's not a totally implausible outcome. Right. And if you got that outcome, you might be like, oh, that's kind of strange, but it's not that big of a deal. But if you're like, I'm going to deal myself 500 hands, you're like, okay, somewhere in that set of 500 hands, I'm probably going to get 3 of a kind. So that doesn't necessarily mean that there's like a thing going on there. So you can just sort of like keep dealing yourself hands in your statistical analysis until you kind of get something that might be, uncommon, but not necessarily unbelievable.
Indeed. Or they suddenly go, oh, didn't get any 3 of a kinds, but hang on, there's a straight. Oh, something must be happening here. So they can just keep playing around with it. And you're right, like the more times you play with it, the more different options you give to say, hang on, there's something different here, the more ways you can come up with a result.
Right. Something else that I'm curious about is just the idea of like these effects potentially being, very real, but also being very context dependent, right? So if I take an example from, my own sort of professional career, right? I mean, I coach people in CrossFit and you give them a training program to do. And sometimes you give someone a training program that works extremely well, right? And it can be difficult to figure out what's actually going on there because, it's a complex system with a lot of inputs. Like maybe they started sleeping better. Maybe they, have been training for 2 years and it was just kind of time for them to hit a plateau. Maybe they started taking Anavar and didn't tell you, but like occasionally it happens where you give someone something, the right place at the right time, and like they get a lot better. And it's potentially a real effect, but it's very contextual. It's not like, oh, every person should be doing this specific blend of like rowing intervals and squatting, but maybe people who are, of a certain capacity at a certain training age, et cetera, should be doing this blend of rowing intervals and squatting, and it will work very well for them. But you can't necessarily extrapolate that as like a big picture idea. So how do you think about the sort of like context dependence of these types of effects?
Yeah, I actually have mixed feelings about stories of context dependence. So as a starting point, I think you're absolutely right. Like context is hugely important. One of the big contexts is actually the person themselves. So what does one person, what one person does, or what's their personality, what's their personal circumstances versus another can be really quite large. So there, I think are hugely important. And I know myself, I've run experiments, done interventions, slightly different contexts. You go, this always seems to work, and then suddenly it doesn't. But the flip side of context is I think sometimes context is also used as a somewhat weak excuse for a lot of the funny results and the lack of reproducibility that we see in this space. And the reason why I call it an excuse is one, like people just throw it out there when something doesn't land their way. They go, oh, hang on, maybe my experiment, maybe it is the piranhas. Maybe my experiment got eaten by the color of the room that I had at the time. but there was this right now. There's a whole bunch of what they call sort of many lab replications going on, where they'll take a famous result and they'll try it, but they won't just run this experiment in one lab. They'll run it in many labs. And in fact, quite often a lot of these are running them in many labs around the world. And so one of these mini labs experiments, probably about 2 years ago now, they looked at about 20 or so papers, ran these experiments across labs all around the world. But what they found there is that those that tended to replicate, those that were robust pretty much everywhere. And those that tended to fail everywhere. There wasn't many that seemed to show really large, in this case, cross-cultural sort of context dependence. So to me, that says that, yes, context is important. We should think about it a lot, particularly when we think about individuals within a group. But when it comes to going, why didn't this particular effect work across a population here versus there, context probably isn't the excuse that we should be going for. We should probably just looking more at, say, the garden of forking paths and other reasons why it may not have worked out.
Got it. So you think that there's potentially a pretty significant context dependence for the actual effect on an individual, but that you should expect, across, a randomized group of humans, that you should have roughly a similar distribution of whatever those, context effects are, and you should still see the result. Is that a good way of summing that up? Yeah,
I think that's right. A lot of the time, there might be different sizes of effects. So think about one of the classic papers in this space by Joe Henrich and some colleagues, where they ran sort of what they call Ultimatum Game across a whole bunch of different cultures, and this included small hunter-gatherer sort of groups, as much as you can be a hunter-gatherer in the modern world. And so the Ultimatum Game is where someone they're given a sum of money, they're asked to split it between themselves and someone else, and that other person gets to choose whether they accept or reject the split. If they reject, both people get nothing, and if they accept, both other people get to take their money away. And what's found, or what tends to be found, in older experiments, is that anything less than about a 30% offer to the person who chooses to accept or reject, tends to get rejected. So people have this real sense of fairness. And so when Joe Henrich and colleagues took this around the world, they actually found quite a bit of variation in what was a fair offer. And in fact, some cultures, they'd offer nearly 100%. They were just trying to give it all away. There's a real gift-giving culture. But the thing was, there was almost no cultures where people didn't share. The rational economic response would be, well, you just offer $1 or just offer 1 cent. They'll accept because it's better than nothing. Whereas we know that's not the case, and that's not the case anywhere. So they're sort of, this, you tell a story either way. One, you could say, look, it's different across these cultures, but the other way is going, that effect exists in pretty much every culture. Pretty much every culture has a sense of fairness. Exactly how strong, that's what varies.
So you would expect to see, if an effect is real, that the actual magnitude of it may vary across different cultures or across different contexts, but that you would expect to see at least some effect kind of across the board. Would that be a good way of framing it?
Yeah, I think that's probably a useful summary. I'm sure someone can dig up all sorts of exceptions, but you look at the results that many labs work, where they ran many experiments around different experiments across the world, and that was pretty much the pattern that you saw. Where if it came out in one, it came out in most, if not all.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. That again, to kind of go back to that Piranha Problem, that if there's all these competing effects, like you said, that are so dependent on the color of the room and whether or not you happen to be reading an AARP magazine before you went somewhere, it's like, dude, what are we even talking about? This doesn't make any sense. So you recently posted some pretty detailed blog posts about ergodicity and loss aversion, which I thought were super, super interesting, which is, why I reached out to you about doing the podcast. And so we've touched on some of these ideas about behavioral economics, and I think we may have even mentioned loss aversion briefly. But can you give just a general summary of the ideas of loss aversion and what that means? And then we'll kind of dive into some of the more complicated stuff that you wrote about recently.
Sure. So let me give you a few concepts here. But to start with, let's just frame a little bit of a problem, and just imagine you're facing a bet, and you've got suppose it's a flip of a coin, and heads you win, tails you lose, and in the world of economics, this will get called a gamble, and so the idea of loss aversion is is around sort of how people respond to a gamble such as that. Now, if someone was just what they call a pure wealth maximizer, they just go, okay, if I flip this coin, I can go, let's work out what the expected gain in wealth is. So let's suppose I win $50 if it comes up heads, I lose $40 if it's tails. Then I go, well, it's a 50% chance of 50% chance of losing 40. That means on average I'll gain $5. So a wealth maximizer will just go, bang, I'll accept that bet every time. Now, there's another concept which needs to be brought in here, sort of for loss aversion, is this concept of risk aversion. And risk aversion and loss aversion are different but quite often confused concepts. And risk aversion is the idea that we prefer a certain sum to a gamble of the same, basically that has the same expected value. So take that example of that flip. So it is an expected sort of value of $5. So that's on average what you gain. So someone who's risk averse would prefer $5 for certain than having that flip. And risk aversion is largely the result of the reason why we are risk averse. It may not necessarily be a psychological thing, but it's simply because every extra dollar a gain actually has slightly less use than the previous dollar. So imagine you get $1 million, it's going to be pretty good. You got an extra million after that, it's still pretty good, but it's not going to be as good. So each additional gain is worth less, and so risk aversion falls out of that because you're there. Because basically that first $5 you get paid is worth a lot more than, say, the small chance of losing 50. Whereas if you lost 40, that'd be pretty sad. Now, the concept of loss aversion, which is different to risk aversion, seems a bit similar. Loss aversion is this idea that the losses literally hurt more than gains. Not just because it's like the dollar, because it's your last, well, it might be your last dollar, but not necessarily because it's sort of you've got less money in that domain, but it's simply because this triggers some internal feeling that really makes you go, hang on, I don't like this. And so the concept of loss aversion, at least in the behavioral economics literature, this is a millionaire sort of flipping the coin for that 50-40 bet. They're going to be pretty much risk neutral. The risk aversion shouldn't be too much there. But if they're loss averse, they'll be there going, oh, hang on, losing $40 will be a little bit painful. I don't like that. It's just that mere act of losing that triggers a response, and that makes them more likely to reject the bet. And the reason why loss aversion is, I suppose, a concept and it's been floated around a lot is that in the lab over the last 40, 50 years, there's been a lot of people who simply reject bets that you go, if this person was either a wealth maximizer or merely risk averse, they wouldn't be rejecting it. They should be accepting this bet. And so something is driving them to reject it. And one of the ways they really dig into this is imagine two different bets. I'll frame two different bets for you. So the first one I gave you was that $50 win, $40 loss. So it involves a $40 loss. Let's imagine instead I offered you a bet where I'll give you either a $40 gain for certain, or alternatively, we'll flip a coin for win 90 or get 0. And if you compare that bet to the other bet, a lot more people would accept that bet of $40 for certain versus win 90, lose 0. They're more likely to go, okay, I'll flip the coin in this case and maybe possibly win 90 because they're no longer worried about a loss. And so that's the other sort of feature which you quite often see in the experiments is they go, hang on, are people, once they're no longer facing a possibility of a loss, suddenly they're like, okay, I'll flip the coin.
Yeah. And something else I think is potentially worth clarifying is the idea of negativity bias as well, right? That I think in a lot of, sort of TED Talk style explanations of behavioral economics effects, people will kind of roll loss aversion and negativity bias together, right? And sort of have the idea of like, if someone leaves a nasty comment on your Instagram post, that's more painful than someone leaving more painful than the positivity of someone leaving a positive comment. But that when we're talking about loss aversion, we're not necessarily talking about like emotional reaction to something negative. We're talking about a more like mathematical calculation of like what type of risk you should be taking or how much you're willing to lose relative to how much you're willing to gain. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think that's right. And there's two ideas which I am always really careful to try and pull apart. Yeah, because you're right. The technical definition of loss aversion in the literature, it merely is exhibited in the decisions. So you could have a loss averse robot, right, if it was just programmed in a certain way. But what is definitely the case, and I think this is really robust, is that we actually have we do have an emotional response to losses. It draws our attention. We pay more attention to them. And so, yeah, whether it's you sort of call it negativity bias or something else, there's definitely this idea where it actually generates a bit of an emotional reaction to, you know, well, we don't like them. And I think that's why kind of in some ways, because they get tied together, the idea of loss aversion, it's so appealing to people because they go, I feel it. Like, I hate losing money. So when you go, okay, was loss aversion real? Like, of course.
Yeah. I think that like you said, it's something that kind of intuitively makes sense to people, because almost everyone has had that example of having a lot of stuff go well for you and something minor go wrong, and you're just so upset and just like dwelling on it. You know, you give some sort of performance, you know, say we put this podcast out and we get a bunch of good feedback on it, and one person is like, that thing sucked. Like, what's wrong with you? You know, like I'm going to think about that. I'm going to be like, what did I do wrong? Why did I make this person so mad? Even if we got, you know, 99 other positive comments. So it is something that, like you said, just kind of resonates with people as true.
Yeah, and then the question is like, after you've dwelled on it and hated it, do you then go, damn it, I'm never doing another podcast in case I get the negative comment? That's when your loss aversion kicks in.
Yeah, totally. So yeah, it's important to separate the idea of like the emotional reaction to something from the actual decision of whether or not to accept a bet. And what we're talking about, to sort of clarify, is the decision to accept a bet based upon the potential losses or gains and the probability of those types of situations happening. So, you know, we've sort of framed this idea of loss aversion, and related to what we were talking about earlier, you know, you've written some stuff sort of explaining that, you know, loss aversion might not be exactly what we think it is in terms of how the effect works. And this sort of like loss averse decision making, which seems on the surface to be kind of like mathematically illiterate, might actually be more intelligent than we give it credit for at sort of first pass. That there might be like a deeper logic to why we might not take certain bets. So can you kind of explain what you know, the framework that you're talking about with these types of bets?
Sure. Well, let me, I suppose in some ways delve into, you know, the experimental literature a little bit, because the reality is it's actually really hard to do a nice, clean experiment on loss aversion, because there's so many other things that tangle up with it. So there's risk aversion, which I described. So, you know, when you get someone says no to a win 50, lose $40 bet, you go, maybe it's probably loss aversion, or maybe, or you go, hang on, it could just be risk aversion, depending on how much wealth they have and what else is going on. So it's really hard to tease them apart. But just the way that people design experiments, there's so many little, you know, possible traps or just ways of setting them up that might lead to different results. And so there's this chap called David Gall, who's been sort of one of the main critics of loss aversion, and he's you know, written quite a bit about it recently. And his big idea is actually that a lot of what we think is loss aversion is actually just a real, you know, really ties us to the status quo. Because what they'll do is when they frame these bets, a lot of them they'll have a status quo option. So I sort of had those two different bets before. So one, imagine, yeah, you've got $0 and it's like, do you want to win 50 or lose 40? Or the other one, you've already got, you know, they go, I'll give you $40 or we'll have a flip for 0 and 90. So exactly the same sort of, you know, I guess up and down possibilities, just from a different reference point. But when you look at the people who do experiments like that, the first one won't be framed as, do you want $0 for certain or win 50, lose 40? They'll just go, hey, would you accept this bet to win 50, lose 40? So it kind of makes the decision to accept that bet a rejection of the status quo of doing nothing. Whereas in the other one, you've got an active choice to actually choose the $40 for certain that you'd have. And so he says that you dig down a lot of experiments, and actually what looks like loss aversion is just people just going, hang on, I'm sticking to the status quo here. Like, why people do that? That's then a whole nother body debate. But yeah, I think that's quite an interesting one. And then you start looking at sort of, you know, broader experimental literature, and people come up with all sorts of other, you know, explanations or anomalies around the literature. So loss aversion tends to appear when it's high, what you call nominal sums versus real sums. So if I have an experiment and you can either heads you win 5,000 cents, tails you lose 4,000 cents. People will be more loss averse than if it's sort of heads win 50, tails lose 40. They'll also tend to be a bit more, just when it's also absolute magnitudes. As that dollar sort of sum goes up, people are more likely to show loss aversion. People are more likely to be loss averse just when it's complicated. So a lot of these experiments, they're not set up. I've tried to make my ones fairly simple there, but instead they'll have sort of quite complicated arrangements. And then, of course, you don't actually get the result of your bet. They'll have some sort of formula which then goes, okay, we'll then take 3 of the 200 bets you've made in the last day and we'll take them and you'll get paid out them. And And again, every time you add that degree of complication to it, people just tend to be more loss averse. And so once you pass it all down, you go, what's left here? And it tends to be, and I tend to say, what's quite solid is that people don't like to, they seem to avoid losses when there's a fairly chunky bet on the table and it's nice and clear what it is and it's not a status quo. I think that's that's a fairly reasonable summary of where we're at.
Yeah, so it's very difficult to disentangle all the effects. And that actually something you mentioned, which I think is really interesting, is that in these experiments, it may not be a situation where people are actually doing something that's going to have a clear outcome based upon their actions, right? It's not like they're investing their money or running a business or whatever, where it's like you get an actual result that's important to you. I didn't realize that it was like, oh yeah, you do all this stuff and then we kind of do another layer of abstraction on top of that to figure out how you actually get money or whatever. Can you explain that more?
Oh, indeed. So quite often a scenario will be just simply because a lab doesn't have that much money, is they'll just say, let's just take a subset of your decisions and then we'll flip a coin for those decisions and that's all you will get paid. So each individual decision, they're going, I don't know if this will count or not. But there's actually a more insidious thing that goes on, and this is slowly being weeded out, at least from some areas. And this is that the decisions are simply hypothetical to begin with. So particularly in psychology, not so much in economics, but in the psychology literature, most of the experiments just involve hypothetical amounts. And so how people respond to play money is there's actually pretty good evidence that there are actually different reactions to it. So in the economics literature, because they quite like making fun of psychologists, quite often they'll run an experiment, they'll compare the two, go here's the hypothetical amounts, here's the real amounts, and here's the people making different decisions, whether there's real money on the table or not.
That's really, really interesting. Yeah, I mean, like we were talking about earlier, clearly people can make quote unquote bad decisions about financial stuff, even if it does have an actual impact on their life. But as you said, if you're doing this kind of weird game with like a complicated bet that sort of doesn't make sense, and it's effectively monopoly money, you have no real incentive to actually even figure it out. You're just like, I don't know, who cares? I'm not doing this.
Indeed. Or, let's just go for it, whatever it might be. In fact, it's got what you actually see, and this is kind of one of the things I think is quite cool in some of this experimental literature, is you actually see quite different people. So quite often what you'll see is there'll be a whole bunch of people who do what they call, basically utility maximization. Like they seem to be, trying to make optimal results. You'll then see other people who seem to be really loss averse, and you actually just see different people tend to make quite different reactions. And so, partly they're going, how much is this experimental design? And different people are going, oh, well, like it's just a game. I'm going to deal with it in different ways. How much of it is genuine personality difference? How much of it is just contextual difference? Like, is someone, they're mainly psychology students, but is someone sort of from quite a well-off family, or is someone from, struggling to pay their way through, and so on? Like what's driving it's pretty hard to know.
And so do you see these significant differences, significant in terms of effect size, not in terms of statistics, since we're talking about science? Do you see these large differences in effect size between individuals, like in the same experiment, where it's like you have some people who do seem to be obviously way more risk averse than other people? You see some people who seem to be much more quote unquote reckless than other people. Is that typical?
Yeah, that's absolutely typical. So there's a lot of heterogeneity, and it's actually a challenge for experiments, because when you've got diverse people, that's why you need such a large sample to try and tease out if there's any aggregate effect. And the fact that sort of psychology has a history of running experiments on 30 people, if that, to some of the economics as well. It's no surprise that so much of it now just isn't working out. Like the sample sizes, given that heterogeneity, were never large enough to find the effect sizes that they were going to. And in fact, one of the quite cool sort of tests that's emerged over the last few years to go, should we trust the literature, is simply to go, given the effect size they found and given the sample size that they used, like how often should they actually be finding an effect size? And quite often the number is like 10, 20%. So you're saying, well, we're seeing all this reported stuff, but if only 10 to 20% of it should really have shown up given the small sample size, well, it shows that clearly there's an awful lot hidden somewhere, and that's just of those that are done properly and published.
Yeah, that's really interesting. To maybe use like a different example of something that might be more intuitive. Like if we think about differences in personality, right? Like everyone has some idea that like people behave differently and like different stuff.
Yes.
Right. So if you just took a group of 30 people and were like, do you like, I don't know, getting drunk and going to a nightclub, right? That like that might correlate with certain aspects of personality that vary across the population.
Yes.
And if you had 30 people and a lot of them liked that, or a lot of them didn't like that, that might show, a significant effect size. But if you're just like a person in the world, you're like, yeah, some people like that and other people don't. That doesn't mean it's like a thing.
Yes. Yeah, indeed. Although, of course, that same thing then is also part of the garden of forking paths problem and what presents it, because this person does this analysis and goes, oh, there's nothing there. Oh, hang on, though. We did collect their information about their view on going to the pub and getting drunk. Hang on, among those who like going to the pub and getting drunk, we found this. And bang, there you go. There's your publishable paper.
Yeah, that's really, really interesting. So essentially, a lot of the studies are just statistically underpowered relative to the variation in these traits across the population. And you hope you get a representative sample, and you hope that the effect size is large enough to sort of like wash out just these inherent differences between people, but it just may be not a thing.
Yeah, that's exactly.
It's tough. It. You got a hard job.
well, it's expensive. I feel for these labs. So I'm kind of lucky in at least part of my day job is I'm working with financial institutions that have a few million customers, and so it's a lot more easy to run a nice high powered experiment. But when you're a psychology lab, I don't know how many experiments they run in a year, and with whatever money they have on hand, it's probably not that easy to pay that many people with real money. And of course, when you're getting to work out again out in the field with really large populations, it's actually also their own money, which also helps.
Yeah, totally. So yeah, we were talking about loss aversion before we kind of got on this tangent. And the posts that you wrote were related to the concept of ergodicity and how that impacts the way that people behave in situations where they're deciding to accept or reject bets, and how that relates to the concept of loss aversion. So can you give us just sort of like, we talked about loss aversion. Can you give us a brief rundown of the concept of ergodicity, and then what you actually the overall concept you're trying to convey with that?
Sure. So ergodicity it's a pretty counterintuitive idea in some ways. So let me go back to my bet to try and illustrate it. So we've got our bet of where we flip a coin and we can win $50 if it's heads, and we can lose $40 if it's tails. And in fact, I'm going to frame it slightly differently. Like, just imagine you've got $100 and it's actually it's 50% of your wealth if you win, lose 40% of your wealth if you lose. So effectively same amounts for that first flip. And your expected gain from that flip. So if every time you can win 50% of your wealth, lose 40% of it, you're going to expect to gain 5% each round. That's your expected gain. And so if you just kept flipping that 3 times, you'd have an expected gain of 5% every round. So that's one concept. So you hold that bit in your mind for a moment. The next bit, though, is let's just imagine what would happen over a really long period of time if you kept flipping that coin. And what you'd expect if you got over a long enough period of time, and in fact, sort of as you go to infinity, it's almost certain that this happens, is you end up with an equal number of heads and tails. That's just going to be the result of flipping a fair coin. So just think, though, if you've got equal numbers of heads and tails. So your first flip, and let's just take the first 2 flips, a head and then a tail. Your first flip, gain 50%, so suddenly you're at $150, so 50%. You've increased 50% of your wealth. Then second flip, you get a tails. So now you're going to lose 40% of your wealth. So 40% of your $150 is $60. So suddenly you're down to $90. And that pattern keeps going the whole way down. So if you had to have equal heads and tails each round, you actually lose 10% of your wealth every 2 rounds, or roughly 5% a round. So you've got 2 different dynamics here in this system. One is what we call basically it's generating an ensemble average. So imagine you could both flip the coin, get both heads and tails at the same time, and average it out, and you're going to get 5% gain. Imagine the other part is what we call a time average, and this is where think about yourself over a very long period of time, just getting heads, tails, sort of equal numbers over time. Doesn't matter what order it comes in, it's the same. And there you're going to lose money. And this is kind of a really nice example of what they call a non-ergodic system, because the ensemble average, this sort of average across the whole population at a population, is different from the time average, which is what an individual would experience. An ergodic system is one where they're both the same. Now, the interesting thing about a non-ergodic system like that is that you look across the whole population. Let's suppose you run that for 100 flips. So everyone in the population does 100 flips. And if you've got a big enough population, you actually see that. So the overarching population wealth will be, around about a 5% gain per round. But when you look at the individuals, nearly everyone will lose, and the amount's just propped up by the extreme good luck of a few people who absolutely make out like bandits and just get all the cash. And so when you look at the within the population, even though an aggregate picture going, look, everyone gained 5% every round, it was a pretty good time for the whole population. You dig into it, and no, most people are actually losers. So yeah, so this non-organic system is pretty tough. And like, to give an example of an organic system, just imagine instead of the percent of wealth each time, it was just a straight $50, $40 every round. Doesn't change with your wealth. There it actually, the population gains $5 on average every round, but an individual would also have that same sort of path. And so that's all ergodic. So there, if you describe the population as a whole, after 100 rounds, you go, look, everyone gained $5 a round for 100 rounds. That's actually not a bad representation also of the individual paths of most people within that population. So you end up with not such an unequal system, not such an unequal outcome, and talking about sort of the whole population and individual ends up being pretty similar stories. In that non-ergodic system, it's talk about the population or individuals, and that's actually feels very different for them.
Yeah, definitely. So to kind of summarize some of those concepts, this idea of ergodicity is, a little bit abstract and be somewhat difficult to parse and really hold in your head. But essentially the idea is that in an ergodic system, over time, if you continue to do the same thing over and over again, that all paths will kind of converge on the average path.
Yeah.
Right. So like something like a coin flip in and of itself, independent of bets, if you flipped a coin 5 times, it's not totally unreasonable to get 4 heads and 1 tails. But if you flip the coin 5,000 times, you expect that to converge on 50-50 between heads and tails, right? And in a non-ergodic system, it doesn't actually converge. That you have some form of let's say path dependence, where you're not actually getting everything to go to the same point. That you have some people, like you said, getting a lot of wealth and other people going to zero. And so if you average those out, you have a certain line that's being drawn over time, but the actual individual paths of each of those people does not converge on that line.
Yeah.
Is that correct?
Yeah, that's exactly it. That's a nice picture.
Yeah. So if we think about this idea of ergodicity then related to these concepts of loss aversion, what you're talking about then is people are potentially not taking certain bets that on the surface seem to mathematically make sense, but I think you were hypothesizing that people maybe have some sort of intuition about the non-ergodicity of the system, and so they decide to not take bets because they understand that they may actually be one of the people who ends up going to zero. Is that a fair summary?
Yeah, it is in a way, but I'm going to pull out a couple more sort of concepts here just to muddy the water slightly more, because so there's this old bet, which is sort of actually, in some ways a classic example of this a non-ergodic system, the St. Petersburg paradox. And it's the idea, imagine you're flipping a coin, and every time you come up, you get a head, get a heads, you get an extra couple of bucks. I think that's right. No, actually double your money, and tails you get zero, and you just keep doing that. And you go, well, how? And I suppose you get to keep what you win up to a certain point of that bet. And so this bet sort of has effectively infinite value, because there's a possibility every time, every single bet, every flip sort of adds to it. So you go, well, should we pay an infinite amount? And obviously no one will. People tend to, they go, okay, hang on, I'm only going to gain, on average $1 a flip. So I need an amazing run of luck to actually get any decent money. People want to pay maybe $10 to play the game. Anyway, so economists grappled with this, and they went, okay, well, what's the solution to this? And from that they went, okay, people aren't wealth maximizers; they're what we call utility maximizers. So people attach a subjective value to a level of wealth, and that's actually how they make decisions. So they don't maximize their wealth; they maximize utility. And so, and the typical kind of utility functions they introduce are things such as, let's just take the logarithm of wealth, and so that means that wealth has, as I sort of talked a bit about before with risk aversion, extra wealth sort of gives you less, each additional dollar of wealth gives you less utility than the previous dollar of wealth. And that's actually how they kind of, I'm putting inverted commas here, solved the St. Petersburg paradox. Now, that was, So economists have worked with that for a really long time and taken that as the framework. And so think about what an expected utility maximizer would do with that bet to either win 50 or lose 40, or win 5%, win 50% of your wealth, lose 40% of your wealth. What would they do if they say had $100 at that point? An expected utility maximizer would actually reject that bet. So a wealth maximizer, someone who wanted to maximize wealth, would take it. An expected utility maximizer with a log utility function, they would actually reject. And so economics has kind of, in some ways, captured actually the intuition of this bet through a really long history of, and whether it's a great foundation is questionable. So the interesting new idea that comes in from ergodicity economics is instead of
and can I jump in quickly just to talk about the actual logarithmic utility function, because I think that's a pretty important concept that might be difficult to sort of visualize, especially if you don't have a background in plotting logarithmic functions. So the idea essentially is that if you're plotting a logarithmic function, it's kind of like a curve that goes to a straight line, let's say, right? Yep. So there's like an asymptote, which is essentially like a point far off in the distance that it's converging to. So it's not a straight line. It's not like a parabola that just goes up, fast and faster and faster. It sort of levels off at some point.
Yes.
So to your point earlier, right? Like if we think about just, if you have $50 and you gain $50 and you have $100, like that's something that feels very good. So that's a big jump in utility. So going from 50 to 100, your utility goes up a lot. But going from $1 million to $1.50 million, your utility goes up barely at all. So essentially, like as you have more stuff, the gain in quote unquote utility, which is sort of like, an aggregate measure of your overall pleasure, let's say, gets smaller and smaller and kind of approaches an asymptote over time where, these marginal gains are no longer something that you actually care about, right? Is that a good summary?
Yeah, indeed. So another way to think about it too is sort of each order of magnitude sort of gain has only the same benefit if you sort of got logarithmic utility. So you'd see the jump from $1,000 to $10,000. That would give you as much joy as the next jump of 10,000 to 100,000 and so on. So it really curtails the how much benefit you get as you go further up. So you need a much bigger leap. So you need a leap of $900 to get a chunk of utility. Then you need the next leap needs to be 9,000 to get that same additional amount yet again.
Yeah, so this idea of a logarithmic utility function sort of captures our intuitive understanding of like how people actually behave, where they're happier about gains that are large relative to what they have.
Yeah, indeed. Okay, I should say, like the way to describe it is, it does capture our intuitive notions, like because then of course you can start getting into there's all this literature which examines share purchasing activity in the lab and so on. And log's kind of okay, but the emergence of behavioral economics, one of its drivers of its emergence was that it didn't capture everything that was going on. There's probably some additional things, but that's when it gets that ultimately behavioral finance sort of a lot of it's founded on an idea. Okay, maybe there's situations where your log utility, despite being a pretty good sort of summation or capture of a couple of features, it's not complete.
Yeah, so it's like a pretty good coarse grain approximation, but you can come up with scenarios where it doesn't quite work out.
Yeah, exactly.
Got it. So I interrupted you, and I think you were starting to actually get into the actual ergodicity stuff. Yeah. So hop back in.
Yeah, indeed. So back to our world of ergodicity, and so imagine we're in our non-ergodic system where we gain 50% or lose 40% of our wealth on each flip, and we've got an average across the whole population increasing 5% every round, decrease for an individual roughly decreasing 5% every round. Now, just think, instead of having to craft a utility function to go, why would you reject that bet? How about the simple fact that humans, or the simple concept that humans might be able to spot when they're in a non-ergodic system and when accepting a bet is not going to maximize their own personal growth rate of wealth, so their time average growth rate. And this is probably the big idea coming out of what they call ergodicity economics, is the idea that, okay, maybe we don't need to try and craft this utility function to try and come up with a psychological explanation for why people reject that bet. Instead, let's just say, hang on, they can come into the system, recognize it is for what it is, and say, well, we're not going to take this bet because look at ultimately it's going to drive us down to zero, because that's going to be what the time average growth rate is. That's what my experience is going to be, because the simple fact is that an individual person can't experience the population average. Like it's a population average, and in a non-ergodic system, that population average simply isn't what you're going to end up with yourself. And that's the second step. What's really interesting here is that, let's suppose you can recognize the system. So let's suppose a person can go, this is a non-ergodic system. What's the decision rule they should actually use? And the funny sort of coincidence of history here is the way to maximize your geometric growth rate of wealth. So if you're trying to maximize your time average growth rate, is called what's maximizing the geometric growth rate. So the multiplication of it. So each round you multiply sort of your previous wealth. It's actually to take the log of your wealth. That's the way to do it. And so the ergodicity economics, the way, despite a different rule, kind of actually ends up at the same point as the economists with their psychological explanation, which is kind of like, it's a weird quirk. So it's either one or two things. One, just a wonderful coincidence of history, or secondly, it's like, ultimately even the economists back on probably had a better intuitive sense of what was going on than they thought, and simply landed on, hang on, we instinctively don't want to take this bet because of the non-ergodicity, and created a more complex rule to capture that.
Yeah. So can you explain the idea of the geometric growth rate again? So essentially we have this idea of, some sort of multiplicative effect on your wealth, right? Where you're not just adding or subtracting with each iteration of the game, you're actually multiplying, which again changes the characteristics of the system. So it's not going to converge on the average. You're going to have haves and have-nots at every stage of the game based upon the fact that you're multiplying. And so this then results in the actual optimum strategy being a logarithmic strategy. Can you clarify that a little bit?
Yeah, indeed. So think about, if you're taking that long flip of long set of flips, win 50% of your wealth, lose 40% of your wealth. So winning 50% of your wealth is like multiplying it by 1.5. Losing 40% of your wealth is like multiplying it by 0.6. So let's imagine you have a flip have 10 flips in a row, and then your wealth at the end of those 10 flips would just be each of the results multiplied by each other. So it'd be your wealth times 1.5 times 1.5 times 0.6 times 0.6 times 0.6 times 1.5 times 0.6, or whatever your outcomes of heads. But each one is multiplied by the last. And what it kind of means is that as your wealth goes down, the size of your next bet and what it's multiplied by is effectively a smaller scale. And as it goes up, it's sort of, you're playing at a higher scale. And so when you've got that series of, multiplications of your wealth, effectively, if you to work out, well, what's the measure that will maximize, if I want to maximize that growth rate and I want to know whether I should accept or not, it's maximize what they call the geometric growth rate. So the geometric growth rate is that sort of multiplication, and if you maximize that, then you're going to get the most wealth you can, at least as an individual, not as someone in the population.
Yeah, and so this may be a little bit difficult to kind of parse, just listening verbally, right? But the idea is essentially that if you're making that decision of should I do this, yes or no, and we have a theoretical utility function, which would be how much pleasure you get from the outcome of whatever the bet is. That the way that you should essentially decide whether or not to take the bet is to sort of run a logarithmic operation on the actual parameters of the bet. So I don't know if we actually mentioned this, but a logarithm is essentially the way that you figure out, what exponent you would need to raise something to in order to get a number, which is again, if you haven't had a background on this and you're trying to parse it via just a podcast, I understand that probably doesn't help or make any sense, but let me go ahead.
Let me take one more shot to describe the logarithm, at least from a mathematical sense. So when we're talking about, just straight wealth maximization, we'd say, well, should we accept the bet? And you'd go, well, let's take, the average outcome of that bet is going to be 0.5 times 150 plus 0.5 times 60. That's your two possible outcomes times the probability that you get them. Whereas to do the logarithm, it's in fact, it's the same sum, except it's the logarithm of 150 and the logarithm of 60 that you're multiplying it by. And what it effectively does is that logarithm of 150 scales it down by far more than it affects the logarithm of 60, which is why in some ways that 60 gets more weight. in this equation, and hence you go, hang on, maybe I won't take it because it's going to drive me down over time.
Yeah, definitely. And so independent of whether or not any of that mathematical discussion made sense, like you said, there's sort of a quirk. There's a quirk of these systems where the kind of, best strategy, if you're thinking about things in terms of a non-ergodic system and the actual theory of this logarithmic utility function, like kind of converge on the same strategy. Is that
Yes.
correct?
Yep. Yeah, that's exactly right. So you'd end up rejecting or accepting the same bet.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And then to kind of circle back to some of the stuff that you were saying earlier, about sort of like, does this pass some sort of sniff test of like, does this make sense? Is there a reason that we would think this way, whatever? We're certainly getting into potential like hand wavy territory about, an evolutionary just so story of like, oh yeah, it totally makes sense. But at first pass, it does seem to kind of make sense that people would have an intuitive reasoning for this type of system. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, well, I think on the one hand, it's clearly it's right. I think that ultimately, if you're in a system where the path that you're going to follow over a long enough period of time is almost surely a loss, it'd be pretty crazy if we weren't able to sense that. And if you actually look at the way that people trade shares, bet, that kind of thing, they certainly seem to exhibit that kind of behavior. There's actually a famous criterion called the Kelly criterion, which is a way of sizing your bet to conform with this rule. And people tend to follow the Kelly criterion or something a little bit even less aggressive than that. So they tend to not go all in. They're definitely not wealth maximizers. They're definitely aware of where the series of bets is really going to shrink their bankroll or send them into trouble. So there's a pretty good evidence for that. I think though that for me, and this is where my evolutionary biology background comes in, would we expect this to evolve? I don't think is a clear answer. Because just think about evolution, right? So evolution isn't just about yourself; it's about your broader genes. And let's suppose you're part of a population. You've got a large family, sort of all your family all have this same gene, which affects whether you want to take the bet or not. And there you can actually kind of experience some of that population average across your broader family. And so in the evolutionary past, maybe it was worth just going all in. Most of your relatives and maybe yourself are all going to go down. But if enough of you carrying your genes sort of win that bet, maybe it's actually the optimal strategy to follow the wealth maximization path and to do it. So either way, on one hand, you've got a hand wavy sort of evolutionary argument as to whether it might be worthwhile. Another, you're going, okay, intuitively, we should be able to detect these systems because it's pretty important. For me, it's just a case of we just need a lot more experimental work to try and tease out what's going on here. And on that, on the one hand, you've got this, if log utility and maximizing geometric growth rate both have the same decisions, you need to come up with some pretty clever experimental designs to go, what's actually different between the two? Like, how would we actually work out if one of those two, if either of them are the right model of the world and how we make decisions? How do you actually pull it apart and go, okay, this is what we do?
Yeah, totally. And so, to your point, you can kind of think of a lot of things that people care about as being these systems that are probably non-ergodic in nature, right? Like wealth in real life or something like prestige or status or whatever, right? If you have more of it, then it's easier to get more of it because a lot of that stuff sort of functions in a more like multiplicative way in real life, right? And you sort of can get like virtuous cycles going. So, again, in a sort of hand wavy way, it's kind of like, yeah, it kind of makes sense that people might understand that like they don't want to go to zero in terms of wealth or status. So they're sort of like, quote unquote risk averse or quote unquote loss averse, but really they're just, optimizing behavior for like, okay, I ideally want to experience a large gain here, but I really don't want to experience one of the sort of like catastrophic loss type of situation. Right. And then to your point about like, okay, well, maybe the strategy then based upon the gene that I have, should be this way or that way. Or maybe, if I shared my gene with a bunch of family members, like the gene should actually, it's okay for me to take a risk because potentially I'm passing, this gene is going to get passed on if enough of us take the risk, meaning enough of us who bear this gene. And I think what you would expect in that situation then would be some sort of equilibrium of like different strategies for risk aversion, loss aversion, recklessness, etc., which based on what you said earlier is like kind of what does exist, is that you see large variance across people in terms of like how they behave in these scenarios.
Yeah, well, and so I've started playing around a bit recently with some evolutionary simulations to try and just get a bit more of an intuition for that. And you can create scenarios where everything goes, and you start to ask questions going, well, does the magnitude of the victory here matter, or does any victory work? So particularly if you think about what's the objective, and this comes back to some of what we talked about at the beginning. If the objective is just purely money, maybe that has one result. If your objective is simply winner takes all and gets all the women, or whatever it might be, or then that might lead to a different strategy. And so when you start playing around with these different evolutionary scenarios and saying what's the real outcome of interest here, I think you can generate quite a lot of different outcomes. When some of them exactly right, like mixed strategies or the like. Because of course, think about a world where you simply need to be in the top 5% of people. Then just rejecting that bet, that we've been talking about through this conversation, is a pretty smart thing, because nearly everyone else is going to lose. You may not be the richest, but if you're going to be ranked pretty high in a just a rank order basis. So it seems like a logical thing. But then, of course, if it's a resource thing, then suddenly you're fried. Like, who's got all the resources has got you. Which world are we? What's the particular problem we're facing at the time? Like, what's a particular bet? I think all that would affect which one's the right strategy.
Sure. And in terms of these simulations, what are you actually doing with that? Are you just sort of like modeling different agents and sort of, iterating them over 1,000 bets, or like, what does that actually look like?
Yeah, exactly that. So creating agents, iterating them over time, giving them different decision rules. So largely, I guess at least my own playing to date, they're not interacting a great deal. So what you're really getting is you're getting people with different magnitudes of wealth and different rank orders. Some of them they're having children, so different rules on how they have children and how their wealth might affect that. And it's it's pretty interesting. I know for myself, my own playing with the simulations with this has really changed my understanding. It's one of those things where it's one thing to hear a conversation, to read a lot about it. It's something else to actually see the numbers and just get a feel for it. And there's some features of it that I didn't even realize were the case without playing for it. So we've talked, to give one example, so we've talked a bit about the idea, you get this almost winner takes all. Someone makes out like an absolute bandit. So the simulations that I played around with, after 1,000 rounds with a population of 10,000, one person would have about 70% of the wealth. So, they've absolutely creamed everyone else. But the interesting thing is then nearly the entire wealth is then concentrated in one person, who then, if they keep flipping, small flips, basically have huge then swings on the population's wealth. And that individual, once you zoom into the individual, you take them another 1,000 generations, and most of the time they're going to lose out, because again, their time average growth rate's really small. So even though over a certain period of time, the average goes up, in the long enough run, everyone loses. So unless you've got some way of generating new people, having kids or growing your population, some way of diversifying your risk, in the really long run, because everyone's in this bet, which almost always leads to ruin, they go to ruin.
Yeah. And I think that another question that I have about that is related to the idea of changing your strategy based upon, your current whatever level of wealth or what have you. Right. And so, we're talking about this, this specific scenario, which is based upon this multiplicative idea of you either get 50 or 40%, 50% gain or 40% loss based upon heads or tails. But again, in real life, if someone, had a certain amount of wealth, the types of bets that they would take would change based upon that.
Yeah.
Right? And they would potentially be taking different bets with different distributions of risk, people investing in venture capital versus investing in stocks and bonds and things like that. So is there a way to actually model that type of strategy as well?
Well, I'm sure there is. It's not something that I've played a lot with, because I think one of the interesting questions for me is what's the floor? So the thing with a multiplicative environment is you can actually never actually hit zero, because you're always only betting, at worst, losing 40% of your wealth. Although you may lose it, it's as good as zero. It's not technically zero, but what's the right way to think about ruin in this ergodic environment? What is the minimum level of wealth so not in the non-ergodic environment, what's the minimum level of wealth that we should have? And you just start putting in floors. Like suppose instead of the floor being, well, just people get going, but suppose they die at 10, you get below $10, you're gone. And actually then it starts to have quite significant sort of changes, because you get people once they drop to a certain level, then they're definitely out, whatever their strategy. There's actually a concept, and it's sort of, it's actually been in some of these discussions around ergodicity economics come up quite a bit. It's this idea of dynamic programming. By this chap Bellman sort of invented it. Well, must be 80 years ago or 90 years ago by now. And it's the idea of how do you think about a long series of bets like this? And basically what you do, the way to think about it is to actually go to the end point and sort of work your way backwards and go, okay, here are all different possible levels of wealth I could be. What would be the level of wealth what would be the possible outcomes from that particular bet? Do I accept or not? And you sort of work your way all back through the tree of bets. And that gets you to a point where then you can go at the beginning going, given all these likely paths that I'd take, should I start down this path? Because I could end up in a really rich domain where I can really sort of make hay and make some good decisions. And if I go down to a bad, if it's heading the wrong way, I can just, pull up stumps and relax. And so there's actually really interesting possibilities there to go, what if people had that foresight and ability to really think through this series of bets and make different calls. Technically, if it's a multiplicative environment, that method of analysis doesn't change the answer. But if it's an additive environment, so imagine if instead of a 50% wealth, 40% wealth, it was just $50, $40 all through time, that becomes a really powerful method of analysis, because even though you go, I shouldn't accept one bet, suddenly becomes a really strong case for taking a whole series of bets, because you go, actually, I might end up in these areas where I've got lots of wealth that I can just make hay. It's got a great expected value over time. I'm going to go for it. So again, here you've got all these other different strategies that you can throw in around how much foresight do people have, how much do they plan, how much do they plot this out. It's pretty rich territory.
Yeah, and even if people aren't necessarily running those calculations or talking through the fact that they're, thinking of the game as iterated repeatedly over time, that it's plausible that our intuition is such that we're assuming that a game is iterated or not, depending on, the context.
Yeah, well, that's right, because the classic story in behavioral economics, in fact, one of the examples that always gets thrown up is, why does someone reject a 50-50 bet for winning 200 or losing 100? It could have been even more mild, winning 110, losing 100. And and people go, okay, a lot of people just say instinctively, okay, I'll reject that bet. Then of course you go, let's do it 100 times, and someone's like, hey, well, the 200, 100, you're no brainer. If you don't take that bet, you're you're absolutely insane. Even the 110, 100, the potential gain versus the loss is just it's just order of magnitude. And so it creates this really interesting problem going, on the one hand, the individual bet doesn't make sense, but then the whole series, you go, we really should take it. And then becomes a debate actually as to, well, is that logically consistent? Is it? And there's this famous economist, Paul Samuelson, who he argued no. He goes, okay, if you don't take one, then you shouldn't take 100. So it's a pretty interesting domain. But in the behavioral economics literature, you don't normally get that series of bets. Normally you got people sitting in the room, they get the bet once, they reject, and then we make all these sorts of assumptions about this person. But you're right, they've got a life. They've got, they've got a car. Maybe, maybe it's insured or not. Maybe what else have they got going on in their life? I don't know. And so when they come in, even if they're assuming it's part of a series, but it's part of a series of sort of decisions and risk taking that they're doing in their life, and they probably have to put all that together. And so, what can you infer about one little observation, not knowing everything else? It's tough.
Yeah, that's really interesting. How do people actually, or how do experimentalists try to control for that? Because I think that's something that, sort of intuitively, again, most people understand, if you're going to play the same game over and over and over again, that your strategy is going to be potentially different than if you're just going to do something once, right? You can think about that with interactions with other people or with bets or something like that. So how do you try to control in the experiment whether or not people are thinking of it as a one-off or as a repeated bet game?
Well, to be honest, a lot of people don't do that very well. Sometimes I'll ask for some basic features such as their wealth to try and control for that in a way. But most of the time, I think people just wishfully think about it. And indeed, that's even just a subject of debate in economics more broadly. Do people assume that the experiment's one-off or not? Because, well, take for example the Ultimatum game I talked about earlier. Like, so one explanation people give for it is they go, okay, well, this person offered,
Which, just to clarify, is the game where you are bestowed a certain amount of wealth, and then you get to share that or not share it, depending on your makeup with your fellow experiment participants.
Yeah, indeed, and so in that experiment, like, the question is, why do people offer as much as they do? And so people go, well, it's rational because I got rejected. Well, why do people reject? Like, it's just leaving money on the table. I know they feel it's unfair, but surely, this is the one-off thing in a lab. And so a lot of the discussion is going, well, actually, do they think of it as a one-off in the lab, or are they thinking about this in the broader context of, again, their life, the situations they're in? Most of the decisions aren't one-off. They're going to meet the person again. That might be because it might be in their local shop, in their local tribe, whatever it might be. And so there's actually quite a lot of discussion around, do people think about these experiments as the one-off shots that the experimentalists kind of design them to be? And my own view is the answer is no. And a lot of that behavior is people they're bringing into them the social norms, the expectation of repetition. They're bringing in a whole bunch of context and knowledge to that game.
Right on. So to kind of sum up then, we have both the idea that we don't know anything and everything is difficult and statistics is hard and a bunch of science is nonsense. And then we sort of simultaneously have the idea of there being these kind of like really beautiful and elegant convergences of different ideas that seemingly explain a relatively complicated human behavior that, on the surface potentially doesn't make sense. So, sounds complicated and pretty exciting, but how do you actually sort of combine those two ideas of, everything being difficult and being skeptical of stuff with the idea of there being this kind of like potential elegance and beauty in terms of how we actually make decisions?
Well, I think there's, for me personally, a good dose of humility in what I do. When you see people making decisions, the first thing to do isn't to label it as a bias, to think that they're making a poor decision. That's to really try and dig under it and go, okay, what could be really driving this decision here? Like, even in the financial sense, sometimes people have, you look at something and you go, hang on, they're leaving money on the table, but underneath it, sometimes you can find a good reason as to what they've done, like the mental accounts they set up, the systems that just happen to work for themselves, even though they don't appear rational. So I think humility is like the overarching blanket. The second piece is, despite the fact that so much has crumbled, there are still some fairly solid pillars underlying a lot of this. So despite a lot of the sexier results of the last 10, 20 years crumbling, a lot of the basic ideas of Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky came up with in the birth of sort of behavioral economics, most of their core ideas are holding up okay. And particularly around ideas such as reference dependence, like we really pay attention to where we are as opposed to thinking in absolute terms. The way that different frames can change decisions. A lot of that is actually really solid. So if you hunt around and look for what's been really well replicated, there are pieces there. I think the last piece is, this is why, is just to actually treat it as a bit of an intellectual hobby as opposed to something that's genuinely going to allow you to change the world. I think we're in some ways we're a long way from understanding how the mind works. There's snippets there, and we should just enjoy that intellectual challenge rather than thinking I need to know this so I can nudge my fellow citizens to be less obese or whatever it is that's concerning us at the time.
Right on. Love it. So there's two blog posts that you have up right now on these ergodicity concepts that anyone who made it this far in the conversation should definitely check those out, because it'll probably clarify some of the stuff that we were talking about. And your website has blog posts going back years, which is a treasure trove of information. So I recommend anyone check that out. Is there anything else that you would like people to look at, or potentially any other posts in particular that you would direct people to?
I think maybe one of the good examples, and we can add that link, is there's actually quite a big debate, around this, whether people are rational or not, between sort of Daniel Kahneman and more his sort of, I guess, intellectual descendants on the one hand, and this chap called Gerd Gigerenzer. And to me, they're kind of the glass half full, the glass half empty crowd. And there's a really interesting debate there around, simply, are there enough errors there for us to think of ourselves as rational or not? And it's just a really cool topic, because it's this thing where you can actually dig down and find clear anomalies. And yet the way that you frame and think about them in terms of the overarching sort of how the human mind works is still, I think, very open to debate. So there's one particular post there. I'd otherwise recommend, Andrew Gilman, who we talked about earlier, sort of has an amazing statistics blog. He regularly just dismembers experiments. And I think it's just an amazing resource for learning how to think about absorbing everything that's out there. So I really recommend getting into it.
Yeah, although it is a fire hose of posts. He posts
Yes.
like 6 times a day. And so sometimes you're like, I don't know if I can keep up with this man.
Indeed.
But that's okay.
Indeed. But as I said, I've learnt more from him than I think anyone. And it's really is a useful skill. Like he's probably like quite a good person to, when there is a paper flowing out there, it's quite technical, and the way that he'll just pull it apart, and you can go into the papers and say, actually, I actually really see this, and having that skill to be able to filter out the I suppose the trash from the treasure is it's valuable. It's maybe like it's the kind of people I try and surround myself with now. It's like who can be really effective at finding the pieces that are useful and that we can apply and that we can that we can make some waves with.
Thanks for listening. If you like the show, the best thing to do would be to send it to one of your friends who also likes podcasts. If you want more, I have an email list where I send out a weekly update with all the podcasts I've recorded and articles that I've written. I also include my favorite things that I've been reading or listening to as well. You can sign up for that at www.toddneve.com. That's I before E, or you can open up the show notes in your podcast player and click the link in there.